Hello, friends, companions of life. This is our third installment of our lecture series or reading series on the pre-Socratic philosophers. This reading will go over Leucippus and Democritus, and then we will end with the Sophists. It is not clear whether the idea of seeds in Anaxagoras' theory had any influence on the atomism of Democritus and Leucippus, but there is at least a superficial similarity in the basic conception. Atomism is the theory that everything is composed of tiny imperceptible objects, each of which is uncuttable. Atomos means uncuttable or indivisible. It was the chief competitor to the systems, different in other respects, but alike in not being mechanistic, put forward by Plato and Aristotle. The atomism of Leucippus and Democritus appears to deal so well with the problems bequeathed by Parmenides and addressed by the other post-Parmenidean pre-Socratics that Aristotle, impressed even though he disagreed, felt obliged to study atomism in great detail. He therefore wrote a work in several volumes on Democritus, alas lost save for a few fragments quoted by Simplicius. The geographical propinquities of the philosophers often suggest reasons for influence and interest among them. Aristotle's birthplace, Stagira, was not far from Abdera, where Democritus and perhaps also Leucippus came from. Hardly anything is known about Leucippus, and it is even possible that he did not exist. Indeed, Epicurus, whom we meet later, denied that he did. Other doxographers variously say that he was born at Miletus in Ionia or Elea in Italy, that is, on one or other extremity of the Greek world, which suggests that this is evidence not so much about where he was born as about the combination of Ionian and Electic elements in the philosophy attributed to him. Yet other traditions say that he was born in Abdera in Thrace, on the northern extremity of the Greek world. This is where his pupil Democritus hailed from. Assuming that Leucippus existed, and he probably did, the books attributed to him on mind and the great world system, Macrocosmos, were written sometime about 440 to 430 BCE. He was therefore a contemporary of Empedocles and Anaxagoras, and unlike theirs, his thinking was shaped in response to Parmenides. Democritus was born about 460 BCE and was reputed to have lived until he was 100 years old. That means he was not only a contemporary of Socrates and Plato, but was still alive when Aristotle was studying with Plato. He was a great traveler, leaving among his many books accounts of his journeys around the ancient world, even to India, according to some doxographers. Indeed, he was a very prolific author, for in addition to his philosophical works, which reigned over metaphysics, ethics, mathematics, and natural science, he also wrote on farming, art, medicine, grammar, literature, and military matters. Some more recent commentators think that many of these books might have been written by his pupils in Abdera, rather as with the treatises attributed to Hippocrates. They would thus be the productions of a school, not of an individual. In any case, one of the philosophical works more securely attributed to him was titled The Little World System, or Microcosmos, a tribute to his teacher Leucippus. The works of Democritus are among the lost treasures of the ancient world, surviving only as quotations and testimonia, as the case of so many others. But there is an added consideration here, which is that most of the quotations and reports are from Aristotle and the commentators on Aristotle, which mean that we see atomism through the eyes of its opponents. The nub of the atomic theory is that there is an infinite number of uncuttable, indivisible, fundamental entities which are eternal and unchangeable in every respect but position. Their eternal immutability in regard to their nature makes them satisfy the Parmenidean requirement for reality. In addition to there is the void or nothingness, but nothingness is real, contrary to Parmenides' claim that there cannot be nothingness. The void is like space in that it separates the atoms, which are therefore able to move in the void and to bump into one another. The idea is that their various shapes make it possible for them to link together into larger agglomerations, and for the agglomerations to break apart again later, thus giving rise to all the phenomena of things and their changes in the sensible world. This captures the idea, found also in Empedocles and Anaxagoras, that coming to be and passing away are just changes, not actual creations and destructions of what exists. The atomists called atoms what is, and the void what is not. Aristotle in the Metaphysics describes the atomist's account of how atoms constitute things as follows. They declare that the differences between atoms, or what is, are three: shape, arrangement, and position. They say that what is differs only in rhythm, touching, and turning. Rhythm is shape, touching is arrangement, and turning is position. Thus A differs from N in shape, AN from NA in arrangement, and Z from N in position. He then adds concerning the origin and manner of motion in existing things. These men also, like all the others, lazily look like to give an explanation. The most authoritative account of the atomic theory occurs in a long quotation Simplicius gives from Aristotle's book on Democritus, where he writes, quote, Democritus believes that the nature of the eternal things is small substances which are infinite in number. As a place for these, he hypothesizes something else which is infinite in size, and he calls it the void, nothing, the unlimited. The substances he calls thing, and the compact, and what is. They have all kinds of forms and shapes and differences in size. Out of these elements he generates perceptible bodies. They are at odds with one another, and move in the void because of their dissimilarity and other differences. And as they move, they strike against one another and become entangled. The bodies fit together and hold each other fast. For some of them are rough, some are hooked, some are concave, and others convex, while yet others have innumerable other differences. So he thinks that they cling to each other and stay together until some stronger necessity comes along from the environment and shakes them and scatters them. End quote. Note that in this account, Aristotle reports an explanation offered by the atomists for motion, that the atoms move in the void because of their dissimilarity and other differences. Theophrastus reports that Leucippus had said that one could infer from the unceasing change and motion of the things we experience that their parts must be an unceasing activity too. So they were not so lazy on that point as Aristotle had complained, but instead offered a naturalistic theory which dispensed with appeals to metaphors of love and strife and justice as putative explanations of motion and change. As regards an explanation of the origin of existing things, two comments might be offered. Atomism certainly offers an explanation of sensible phenomena, this being the combinings and separations of the atoms. In this sense, the atomists do what the Ionian pre-Socratics previously did, which is to say how the arche gives rise to or constitutes the world we experience. By contrast, it is hard to find in Parmenides an account of why the world seems to us as it does, as a plural and changing realm, other than by just saying that our senses are deceitful. Aristotle, of course, meant that the atomists did not offer an account of how atoms in the void come into being in the first place, but then neither does anyone else say how reality or whatever arche they nominate comes to be. But what is interesting about the atomists' response to the Parmenidean challenge, namely that anything real must be eternal and unchanging, is that it both accepts it and defends pluralism. The Parmenidean argument was that if there are many things, each must have the same character as the one. And the atomists in effect said, fine, but why can't there be infinitely many things with the metaphysical properties of what the eclectics call the one? On the question of infinite divisibility, they rebutted Zeno's argument in effect by accepting it. Zeno had said that it is incoherent to assume infinite divisibility, and the atomists said, we agree, which is why we argue that the atoms are, as the name implies, not divisible infinitely or otherwise. As with their predecessors, the atomists offered views about the heavenly bodies, perception, and the contrast between what Democritus called true-born and bastard knowledge. Whereas the cosmologies of the ancients can illuminate the metaphysical and epistemological views that underwrite them, they otherwise have in the main historical interest only, and this might be said also of the atomists' account of the sun, the moon, stars, and of the vortex in which, oddly given that in centrifugal systems the heaviest objects are flung the furthest, heavier bodies lie at the center of the cosmos. Theophrastus is the chief source for what the atomists say on these matters. Along with the philosophies of Plato and Aristotle, atomism is the most influential of the ancient philosophies. It was the inspiration for Epicurus later, and through him of the Latin metaphysical poem De Rerum Natura by Lucretius, and eventually of the science of the modern world in the ideas of Gassendi and the 17th century Capulscarians. corpuscle in the effect another word for atom, although it means little body rather than uncuttable thing. These views have been praised as a high point in pre-Socratic philosophy by such scholars as Jonathan Barnes, who describes atomism as, quote, the culmination of early Greek thought, end quote, and Theodore Gompers, who said it was, quote, the ripe fruit on the tree of the old Ionic doctrine of matter, end quote. As just noted, however, this Ionic fruit was served by the atomists in an eclectic dish, hence it greatly enhanced intellectual piquancy. The Sophists. In the original meaning of the word, a sophist was an educated person with experience in one or more fields of learning. Sophos, meaning clever, skillful, wise. By the 5th century BCE, sophist has come to designate something more specific than this, a person who made a profession and earned a living thereby, out of offering to teach the techniques of rhetoric and oratory. Being good at public speaking was a highly prized skill in the cities of classical Greece, still largely an oral culture and certainly one where the reputations and status of individuals turned in significant part on the showing they made in public debates, in advocacy, by eloquence, persuasiveness, and power of command over an audience. Because this was such a desirable skill, sophists made a good living teaching it. It was at a particular premium in the Athenian democracy of the 5th century, where political and legal debate lay at the center of the city's life. Socrates and Plato disliked the sophists on the grounds that they offered to teach in exchange for money, the ability to persuade others to any point of view, which meant that they taught people how to win arguments, not how to discover truth. In the Euthydemus, Plato gives examples of the tricks that sophists offered to teach anyone wishing to beat opponents in debate. No doubt this was indeed what many sophists did, and because Socrates and Plato were critical of them, the word sophist now has a pejorative connotation. We talk of a tricksy argument as sophistical. The act of bamboozling others is called sophistry, and the word sophisticated, though now used to describe a refined taste, superlative elegance, and the like, in its original meaning implies anything deliberately made complicated and bewildering in order to mislead others. This view of the sophist is, although no doubt more justified than not, at the same time not entirely fair. In addition to teaching rhetoric and oratory, the sophist also taught what was required to accompany an ability to be a good public speaker. For there is no use in being eloquent if you have nothing to be eloquent about. If you know no history or literature, if you know nothing about ideas, if you have never reflected on right and wrong, the state of society, and how to live a successful life. Greek society in general became more literate, wealthy, and advanced in the 5th century BCE, and the desire for an education beyond the traditional basics of arithmetic, literacy, and gymnastics had greatly increased. The theories of philosophers and an interest in geography, history, and other societies and cultures fueled the appetite for rational discussion and intelligent debate. The sophists accordingly were educators in more than just rhetoric, and part of what they offered to teach was a philosophy of life, or ethic. This aspect of what they did drew the particular attention of Socrates, whose own primary interest was the question of what constitutes a genuinely good life, and he therefore engaged with and challenged others, not least the sophists, to explain and justify their views on this matter. Although they are bracketed together, the sophists were not a school and did not have a joint outlook or doctrine. They were individual teachers, traveling professors, even performers, in that they gave displays of rhetoric as well. They were not inclined to hide their lights under bushels, it seems, as we learn from Plato's account of the most famous of them, Protagoras, a native of Abdera, where Democritus hailed from. Protagoras lived between 490 and 420, and was one of Pericles' associates while the great statesman was alive. Plato gives a compelling portrait of him, having him say, "My boy, if you associate with me, the result will be that the very day you begin, you will return home a better person, and the same will happen the next day too. Each day you will make progress." End quote. Moreover, Protagoras claimed the pupil will become stocked with good counsel so that he can effectively manage his household affairs and the affairs of the city, and he will be powerful in acting and in speaking. Other quotations for Protagoras, reported by Stobaeus, Pseudo-Plutarch, and others, suggest that he was no mere blusterer. He said that learning must begin early, that it must sink deep roots to be effective, and that it requires much practice and dedication. Quote, "Art without practice and practice without art are nothing." End quote. But he also gave reason for Plato's antipathy toward him. He disliked mathematics. The subject matter is unknowable and the terminology distasteful, he thought, and he is credited with being the first to state the view that, quote, there are two mutually opposed arguments on any subject, end quote, one of the reasons invoked by latter skeptics to deny the possibility of knowledge. It was on this basis that he also said that one could successfully argue either side of the same case, as one doxographer put it. Protagoras made the weaker the stronger argument, and taught his students to blame and praise the same person. Plato puts a speech into Protagoras' mouth in which, after agreeing with Socrates that what should be taught is how to run a city and make good citizens, he sets out his view that good citizenship consists in the practice of justice and self-restraint. He says that these are natural propensities which education can and should foster in people, because they conduce to the preservation of good order in society, and therefore to the survival of its members. These views are unexceptionable, but in the Theaetetus, Plato reports another and more controversial of Protagoras' views, that man is the measure of all things, of things that are, that they are, and of things that are not, that they are not, end quote, which is said to be the opening sentence of his lost book, Truth. This seems to be a statement of relativism, implying that there is no objective truth, but that what is true for one person might not be true for another, truth being relative to the different experiences or circumstances of different people. Before refuting this view, Socrates explores ways in which it might be the case that different points of view have validity through appearing to contradict each other. For example, one city might have a law against something which in another city is permitted. Then a citizen of the first can say such and such is wrong, while the citizen of the second can say such and such is not wrong, and they can both be right. But this is not what Protagoras' contemporaries and successors took him to be saying. They saw him as asserting subjective relativism, which has two people holding with equal personal justification opposite views on the same question, no adjudication between them being possible. This view does not look consistent with the idea that justice and continence must be universally accepted in order for society, indeed for the human species itself, to survive, as Plato reported Protagoras as arguing. The point is a significant one, for one of the greatest debates of the 5th century BCE concerned the question of convention or law, as invented by humans versus nature. Nomos, meaning law, versus physis, nature. Are moral norms the result of human agreement and custom, or are they rooted in the nature of reality? There was widespread agreement that for morality to be genuinely authoritative, the latter must be the case. This allowed critics of conventional morality to argue that it was merely the product of human preference. It should be rejected. Defenders of conventional morality replied that it did indeed have its roots in nature. The debate was a vigorous one. In his dialogue, Gorgias, named for another famous sophist, Plato has Gorgias' pupil, Callicles, argue thus: conventional morality was invented by the weak to protect themselves against the strong, inhibiting the latter from doing what by nature they have a right to do, which is to use their inferiors for their convenience. The genuine norms are those exemplified by beasts, which behave wholly in accord with what nature dictates. A somewhat milder version of this view is held by Thrasicimus in the first book of Plato's Republic, where he praises the tyrant who overcomes the restraints of conventional morality in order to assert himself. If these views appear to anticipate Nietzsche, they do so only in part. Nietzsche certainly described slave morality as the weak's promotion of their sufferings and vulnerabilities into virtues, and argued that the superhuman should assert himself positively instead, but not as I read him at the expense of anyone else less robust. Where Callicles and Thrasicimus agree in holding that a life of self-assertion is a supremely happy life because it is lived in accordance with nature. In his speech in the Protagoras is on the side of those who hold that moral conventions arise from nature. The inconsistency of this with his famous man is the measure view therefore raises the question of exactly what he meant. The fragmentary nature of the evidence leaves it open that there could be an interpretation which eliminates the inconsistency. This much is suggested by a fragment in which the word things used suggests that differences of subjective attitude apply to things produced by human choice and thought, especially beliefs, attitudes, and judgments, rather than to things determined by nature. Since the basis of morality lies in nature, as Protagoras otherwise held, there would not be two opposed but equally supportable truths about it as there would be in the kind of case where one person feels cold while another feels hot in the same place on the same day. That way of reconciling the conflict in Protagoras' view runs into the difficulty, however, that his celebrated dictum, man is the measure of all things, reminds one of Aristotle's definition of truth and falsity, and it contrasts with Protagoras' view. Quote, to say of what is that it is not, or what is not that it is false, while to say of what is that it is, and of what is not that it is not, is true. End quote. Protagoras seems to be asserting that what we say makes things be as we say they are. Aristotle's definition tells us that what we say must correspond to how things are in order to be true. Hamlet says there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. Protagoras here appears to be saying that everything is what people say it is, as opposed to being objectively the way it is, independently of our individual interests. This would indeed conflict with the view ascribed to him in the Protagoras, that there are natural propensities in people to manifest restraint and a sense of justice. Among other leading sophists mentioned by Plato in his dialogues, we have seen one name, Gorgias, already. Others that merit mention are Prodicus, Hippias, Antiphon, and Critias. Gorgias, a contemporary of Protagoras, was born in Leontini in Sicily. He lived until he was 100 years of age and became celebrated for his elaborate rhetorical style in both speech and writing. He is said to have taken Athens by storm when visiting there on a diplomatic mission in 427 BCE, because he gave public displays of his oratorical and rhetorical skills, demonstrating the power of persuasion in the defense of Helen of Troy. To do this, he chose the most indefensible of the reasons for her going to Troy with Paris, namely that he persuaded her to do so. The other reasons were that fate, necessity, or the spell cast by Aphrodite made her helpless in this case, and therefore unblameable. This is an example of making the weaker case the stronger. Prodicus was a native of Ceos, an island in the Aegean Sea across the coast of Attica. His date of birth is estimated at 460 BCE, making him a contemporary of Socrates, and indeed it is said that he was an associate, perhaps even a teacher, of Socrates. A passing remark by one Didymus the Blind says that Prodicus denied that contradictions are possible, on the grounds that if two people appear to be contradicting one another in conversation, they cannot be speaking about the same thing. He also said to have denied the existence of the gods, and this puts him in the same boat as Protagoras, who was also either an agnostic or an atheist, if certain quotations from him bear that interpretation. Perhaps this is another reason why Plato disliked the Sophists. As a result of his fame as a teacher and speaker, Prodicus grew wealthy, and so did Hippias, the fourth of this group of famous sophists. Hippias was born at Elis in the Peloponnese. His dates are unclear, but he was known to be still alive when Socrates died in 399 BCE. And of course, as you know, we only know about Socrates because Plato was basically the one who was writing about him. He was a man of wild interest who, in addition to teaching rhetoric and mnemonics, the art of memory, contributed to mathematics and made a collection of poetic and philosophical texts. He was celebrated for his speeches, which included improvised discourses on any subject proposed by members of his audience. The breadth of his interests and talents prompted Plato to poke fun at him, saying that he was such a polymath that he could even cobble his own shoes. A remark attributed to him by Xenophon is, how can anyone take laws seriously, given that it often happens that the same people who make them later repeal them and put others in their place? Antiphon, an Athenian, was born around 480 BCE. He was a contributor to the debate about nature and convention in morality. He said that when in society one should obey the conventional laws, but when alone one should obey the laws of nature. He thought that conventional laws often contradict natural laws, making people suffer more pain when less is possible, have less pleasure when more is possible, and receive injury when it is not necessary. Nevertheless, he took the view that the power of rhetoric can make the worse seem the better in an argument, which presumably means that one could defend conventional morality against the claim of nature even when this makes people suffer more. However, convincing the accusation is on behalf of the accuser, he said. The defense can be just as convincing, for victory comes through speech. Critias was another Athenian, an associate of Socrates, whom Plato mentions. He was also an older relative of Plato's, and therefore, like him, an aristocrat. He took the opposite view in the convention-nature debate, defending convention. Quote, human life was once without order, on the level of the beast, subject to force. There was no reward for the good or punishment for the bad. Then people established laws as punishers so that justice could be the mighty ruler of all equally and make violence its slave. End quote. For him, as for Thomas Hobbes many centuries later, the state of human nature the state of nature was the source not of good but of ill, and it took the application of reason to bring justice into the world. From the viewpoint of subsequent history, the antipathy felt by Plato for the Sophists is highly consequential. The key point for Socrates and Plato is that philosophy is the pursuit of truth, and it cannot be contained or constrained by the necessity of winning a case or earning a fee. In our own day, we are rightly skeptical of expressions of opinion that have been paid for. Pharmaceutical companies paying doctors to prescribe certain drugs, politicians acting on behalf of donors, and the like. The point is that Socrates and Plato insisted on holds, that truth should not be for sale. Thank you for joining me with my series on philosophical readings from A.C. Grayling's The History of Philosophy. The only other one that is best to this is Bertrand Russell's, and that needed an update, so Grayling gave us an update. It goes over ancient, medieval, modern philosophers, contemporary philosophers, of which I will cover mostly contemporary philosophers in our reading series. And I've read the whole book, so it's really good. He also has a section on Chinese philosophy, Arabic Persian philosophy, Indian philosophy, and then very simple but very profound African philosophy. So I really appreciate you watching this video. If you watched it, I hope you learned something. I hope that it was informative, and I hope that you will be able to love philosophy and to have a passion for philosophy as I have. May you forever pursue wisdom and truth and virtue. Thank you.